testimonies. I love to hear what God is doing in people's lives and to hear what he has been doing on an ongoing basis. And we have two people this morning who are going to tell us about what God has been doing in their lives. And I'm going to first of all invite Steve Metcalf. Can we just welcome him? And Steve, you will see Steve at the door and you will see Steve on the drums. And now you're going to hear all about who Steve is.
Hear what I sound like. Well, this is the first time I've ever shared the events of my life in any public forum. Very, very few people know really anything about me, and that's the way I've kept it. And you'll see why. Many of you will know that my name is Steve Metcalf, but I was actually born Stephen Paul Rugg on February the 4th, 1960, in Watford. Stephen Paul, and my brother was Peter Mark. I think my mother had biblical delusions. Anyway, my mum told me that at that time we were very happy. My mum worked at the Seventh-day Adventist British HQ in Stanborough Park in Watford, and she and my dad were both Seventh-day Adventists because my mum's mum, my nan, was a very strict Seventh-day Adventist. You would describe my nan as with words like stoic or stiff upper lip or reserved, British, even Victorian. So I went to Sabbath school on a Saturday, not Sunday school. It taught me the Bible. It taught me a lot about the law. It didn't tell me much about relationships, and I don't remember hearing too much about Jesus. My dad was the bodybuilding champion of Hertfordshire. He didn't smoke and he didn't drink. And he died of lung cancer in 1963. He was 26 and I was 3 years old. I don't remember anything about it. It was never discussed until I was in my 40s, and apparently someone at the funeral told my mum that it was God's will, and she never went to church again. She had a nervous breakdown and was sedated. My dad's mother also had a complete mental breakdown and blamed my mum for my dad's death. The grief of losing her son meant she didn't speak again for the rest of her life. And I didn't see her or my dad's father, my granddad, for over 20 years. So I was 3 years old, no dad, effectively no mother, and only my mum's parents involved in my upbringing, which largely fell to my highly orthodox, traditional, but amazing grandmother. My nan, being a strict Seventh-day Adventist, never went in a pub, she never drank alcohol, she never ate pork, she never smoked, she never ate shellfish. It's quite a Jewish sort of way of doing things. She had had a very tough life. She lost her dad at Delville Wood, or as they called it, Devil's Wood, on the Somme in 1916, when she was 6. And she lived in Islington with her extended family in pretty much abject poverty during the Blitz in World War II. Apparently 694 bombs were dropped in her area alone. She brought me up in the same way that she brought up my mum in the 1940s, highly disciplined, unemotional, striving to be the best. There's no doubt that my nan loved me, I know that, and I loved her as a child loves its caregiver. I loved my granddad, my mum's dad too, but he died when I was 11. He was quiet and gentle, but he left all the family things to my nan. And my nan continued looking after my brother, who was not even 1 year old at the time, and me for another 2 years until I was 5. And my mum married my dad's best friend from school. I don't think she really knew what she was doing due to the sedation, the drugs. And I was adopted in 1965, and that was when my surname changed from Rugg to Metcalf. My stepdad wanted my mum, but I don't think he wanted the 2 young boys that came with her. And there was a lot of heavy-duty discipline, smacking, shouting, but that's what parenting was like in the 60s for many of us. So now I was 5 years old. My mum was still under sedation, and the man I now called Daddy didn't really want me around. My real dad wasn't there, so I had a profound sense of rejection, abandonment, and isolation. And even my wonderful nan wasn't around now. So I developed a coping mechanism, and all feelings, emotions, and memories of my dad were compartmentalized, stored away deep in my mind where they couldn't easily be recalled. I was never able to grieve for him, and when I actually grieved, and what I actually grieved for was being cheated of love and affection and emotion in my childhood and what might have been, which is far too painful to deal with, frankly, and so was kept locked away for 50 years. At 5, I also started to play the drums. Apparently, I'd always loved music since I was a little tot, so I used to groove along to the Beatles and the Dave Clark 5, apparently. I suppose it was some sort of physical outlet. Anyway, the way I dealt with this was I took on the identity of an achiever. So here's a list of things, and you'll see why I've given this list in a minute. I was top of my class at primary school. I went to the best grammar school in Watford Boys. I was top of my class there. In my first school report, I was described by my teacher as a model pupil. I played the drums in the school theatre productions when I was 11. I was in all the sports teams, some of which I was the captain. I went to university, got an honours degree in history. While there, I played in a band that released a load of records, and we appeared on Radio 1, on the television, and supported a big band called Def Leppard in front of 2,000 people. I got a job at IBM, very prestigious at the time, in 1982. I bought my first Porsche when I was 25. I was chosen to work in California when I was 27. I was headhunted by Hewlett-Packard. Then I joined Microsoft in 1997. And even there, I won the top award, what they called the Platinum Club, in the entire company in 2011. And they sent me to Hawaii for a week. I regularly earned more than $150,000 a year. I had lots of friends, and in the world's eyes, I was a total success. But it was just a mask, of course. I don't remember ever feeling emotional warmth or love from anyone. I don't remember ever having been really happy or fulfilled. And according to my mum, I sailed through adolescence, for example, as if it didn't exist. I got married in 1982. She had an affair, and we divorced in 1987. I remarried in 1989, but I got divorced when she had an affair in 2012. Neither of my marriages had any emotional basis. I even became a born-again Christian in 1997 at the Elim Church in Watford. I was appointed to the worship team almost immediately because of my musical past. I knew I was saved in my head. I just didn't know what being in a relationship with anyone, let alone Jesus, felt like in my heart. And when I moved to High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire, I became the worship leader there and carried on for another 10 years. So here's this unemotional guy who doesn't really know what love is, being the worship leader. They didn't know anything about my true character, and that's the way I kept it. I also never raised my hands in public to Jesus. And I see now that I was a prideful, arrogant person who believed everyone should be capable of perfection. I was never intentionally cruel, but I could be exceptionally nasty. I was known as the Simon Cowell of the church. It's true. I even once reduced a member of the worship team to tears when they couldn't get this piece right. Proverbs 4:23 states, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And I didn't really know God. I didn't know he loved me because I had no concept of what love looked like. Someone can tell you that, for example, honey is sweet, but if you've never tasted it, how will you know? Similarly, I know that God loves me and is love because I've read it and I've been told it, but I don't know what that feels like. I knew I was a sinner, but what crimes had I committed? As far as I was concerned, the worst thing I'd ever done was get a speeding ticket. Although I have also walked around IKEA the wrong way. Yep. It's as bad as it gets. It's only relatively recently that I've, at last, with my lovely wife Maria's help, started to open up emotionally and realize that I am guilty of some of those unseen sins. Pride, lust, anger, but especially pride. Pride stops you acknowledging the grace and power of God. It is said to be the foremost of the 7 deadly sins. It doesn't recognize that, as it says in Colossians, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Prideful people don't consider their abilities and talents as God's gifts, but attribute them to themselves. Deuteronomy states, "You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me, but remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth." So I needed to discover humility, and I'm on that amazing but painful journey. And God is having his way. Last year in October, I lost that high-paying job. It wasn't how it seemed at the time. In November, as some of you know, I had a stroke. I'd never been ill in my life. I'd never even spent a night in hospital. And after 8 months and 171 job applications, I am still out of work. And for the first time since I left university, money is tight. My knowledge and resources have failed. My gold-plated reputation for success, at least in the world's eyes, is shattered. And that's a pretty good way of being forced to deal with pride through God's tough love. For the first time in my life, I need a different solution that isn't based on what I can do, because let's face it, that just isn't working, but on what God can do. So I'm searching for a father who won't abandon me, reject me, or hurt me. And Psalm 65 states that God is a father to the fatherless. And I'm searching for genuine love and meaningful relationships, but I know I'm getting closer to the day when I will raise my hands in worship to the one who created me. And fortunately, finally, I have an amazing wife who's helping me on that journey. And my relationship with Maria could, with good reason, be described as robotic. In fact, when she used to want to discuss something with me, she would actually ask me to have a meeting. Is it in the diary? No one was more surprised, actually, when the pair of us got together 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago. But God has used her to help bring about the change in me, and slowly but surely, that is what's happening, and all glory to him. Thank you.
That's very brave of you to share so much, especially when it's not how you've done things in the past, but it's a new day, Steve. It's a new day, a new era, and God is just bringing a new Steve out of you. Hallelujah. Joe.
Thanks, Liz. Put that there. I've got a bit of a croaky voice. I'm Joe. Most of you will know me. Most of you will know who I am. That I'm married to Darren. That I've got 3 kids, nearly grown up now. Aaron's the littlest. He's 12, nearly 13. That I sing and play on the worship team. That I'm involved in the youth team. That I'm involved in Soul Sisters. That I'm a school governor. I've got a really good life. I've got a life that's really, really blessed. I feel that my life, like Steve said, is, people look and think you've got a good life, you've got what people want, but it's not through any of my own endeavours. It's through being blessed by God, because my life wasn't like that. I think when we hear people's testimonies, we realise how similar our testimonies can be. For me, I grew up with my mum and dad. I thought, when you're little, when you're at that point where you think your normal is normal, isn't it? Everything that is normal to you, you think is normal to everybody else, and then you actually get to a point where you realise that it isn't normal. You know, my parents, my dad used to come home from work, and as soon as he came home from work, the screaming and the shouting would start. You know, my dad would just lose his rag at the slightest little things. We used to sit in our bedrooms. I used to bite my nails. I used to bite all down my thumbs and my fingers so they were red raw and so they'd bleed. I mean, that was before self-harming was a thing. It wasn't recognised as a thing then, but I recognise now that was what I was doing, that I was pulling all the skin off my hands because it was just constant shouting. It was constant. You just didn't know what was going to kick off next. You know, would it be a window? Would it be something else? And the thing is, it got worse. My mum and dad split up when I was 14. He left. Mum left. Mum went to live with somebody else. I left and lived with her for a couple of years. And again, it was just hard. My mum's quite a controlling person. I wasn't allowed my friends round. I was split away from my friends and my dad and my brothers because I absolutely adore my brothers. And at 17, in the middle of my exams, my mock exams, I went and lived back with my dad. My mum left and went to Devon because she wanted a new start. And my dad, after a few different relationships, had then married. He married, I would say he married the stepmother from hell. She really was. If you know all the fairy stories, they've got nothing on my stepmom. She was evil. She was pure evil. She was, you know, her aim was to destroy, to reap havoc, just to cause as much problems as possible. By 17, I was a total wreck. I was very thin. I hadn't got an eating disorder as such, but eating was my only control in my life, so I didn't do it. I ate as little as possible. I really was. 17, I was so painfully thin that my periods hadn't started. And I was a mess. I'd been, you know, physically abused by a family member. I'd lost trust. I'd lost all my trust. I'd lost my trust in people. I'd lost my trust in adults. I'd lost my trust in everything. And it was just, you know, I was an achiever at school. I was in the top set, and I just totally bummed out of everything. I messed up my exams on purpose because I didn't want to do what anybody else wanted me to do. I didn't want to do A-levels. I wanted to sink into a hole and die. At 17, I rationalised whether to commit suicide or not. And I decided, because I was an atheist. In my eyes, I was a really, really good atheist. I hated God. He'd done nothing for me. I burned Bibles. I was abusive to Christians. As far as I was concerned, God had got nothing for me, never done anything for me. And that was it. And that was my rationalisation in committing suicide, because I decided that if I killed myself, there was nothing. But I decided that if I stayed alive, that there was a possibility it got better. And I found a coping mechanism, and my coping mechanism was drinking a lot, smoking cannabis, just anything that would blot out what my life was, anything that would just reduce me to a state where I didn't have to think about what my life was, that I didn't have to go back to where my dad and my stepmom were screaming at each other. You know, it was that same thing again, just violence, you know. Oh, it just wasn't good. And that was me at 17. You know, at 17, I was in that place where I didn't want to live. I was blotting out everything in my life, and I was really, really hurt. And that's why I say, you know, testimonies are so similar, because a lot of us come from a place of hurt. I said, you know, my mum had gone to Devon. My dad was in this depression. I used to sleep with a knife under my pillow. You know, that was the point that it was at. And then my stepmother left, and my dad was still in this depression. And I got on. I managed, I coped. I don't know how I coped sometimes. I said, you know, I wouldn't advocate in any way what I was doing. I woke up in hedges. I don't know, well, I do know now how I survived, because, you know, God was obviously still with me. God has obviously got my back. He's always had my back. So at 19, my life did change. My life started to get a lot better. The year before, I'd got accepted onto a JTS, and I started working in an office. I'd originally worked with children, and then I realised I couldn't work with children. My head was so messed up and so scrambled. I was making attachments and finding finding, I suppose, security and love with the kids that I was dealing with. And then when they'd go somewhere else, I was absolutely heartbroken. So I knew that wasn't for me. It was something that was in my heart, but I knew at that time I wasn't the right person to be working with children. So I ended up working in an office, and it was great. It was a new start. And then at 19, I met Darren. And again, you know, my life got so much better. I stopped drinking so much. I didn't get drunk. I'd got no need to get drunk anymore. My life was actually happy. I didn't need to blot out everything anymore. And we got married, and I built a new life for myself with Darren. And Darren was my family. Darren was my new start. Darren was my security. You know, everything that was my family, everything that was the rubbish from before had gone. And God still played no part in it. And then things started to change, as they do. God starts to poke you a bit. He starts to prompt you. My job, one of the people that I work with, Eric, I'd gone in early one morning. It was weird how it all happened. It always is when God's in part of it. But I'd gone in early that morning because somebody else was off sick. And I worked in a steel factory, and you used to quite often hear all the racks tumble, because they're like dominoes, and you've got the high with all these steel on. And I'd heard the racks tumble, thought nothing of it. It was quite early, and then the lads who I worked with downstairs, he ran upstairs and he was like, "Jojo, you've got to come. There's been a massive accident." Ran outside the Stills warehouse, and there was Eric. He was the Stills warehouse manager, and he was crushed under loads of steel. And he shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been moving the stuff that early, but he was. And we stood and we watched him die, and we couldn't do anything. And then the ambulance got there, and they couldn't do anything because they've got to wait for the fire brigade. And that was my moment. That was my moment of realisation, because I realised that what was him had gone. In that split second between living and dying, he'd changed from from a person just into a body, and I knew there was something else. And I went home and I was totally freaked out. I'd always been frightened of the dark when I was little, and that was it. And then, I was scared of the dark again. I couldn't figure out what was going on, but I knew there was something more to life than what I'd been putting into life. And that was when I started a journey, and I went down all the wrong paths. I started reading tarot cards. I went to mediums. I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know what was going on in my life. And then I had a nasty car accident as well. Again, I walked away from this car accident. It was really freaky. We'd got a new car, hadn't we? We'd got a new car that new car, it's 3 years old, Darren's uncle was giving us. And we'd got our car for half an hour after I left work. So I'd got enough time to get home. And then we changed the insurance. 5 minutes after I came out of work, joyriders came up behind me, wrote off my car, pushed me into another car, which was 3 days old, ripped that off. My car was round. It was total mess. You couldn't shut the door because there was a crease across the roof. The axles was all... My passenger in the back, she'd got no seat belts on, but she'd been and bought towels from Dunelm, as you do. And that had protected her, stopped her legs from breaking. I'd got bruises all over me, but I was fine. And we went home that night. Darren had picked me up in the new car. He's like, "Oh, it's got electric windows." And I'm like... I can't breathe, don't tell me about electric windows. I'm petrified of being in a car. And on the news that night, there came another really bad traffic accident, and Darren said, "That wasn't as bad as your car. All 4 people in the car had died." And I just thought, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Why am I still here? Why am I not dead? Life goes on. We had our first child. We had Sammy. I was a long time in labour. I had an emergency C-section, and we were both lucky to be alive. And I really, really struggled being a new mum. I said my mum was controlling. A lot of that control, I took on. Because people wrecked my life, I had to take control of my life. I had to have my security. My control was my security. And I realised when I had Sammy there, I'd got no control. You have your first child and you realise your life's just completely shattered. It's like, oh, what's happening now? And I couldn't cope. I went back to work at 16 weeks. 2 years later, I had my second child, Jared. And I realised when I had him that I'd had postnatal depression quite badly with Sammy. But me being me, I was just like, no, everything's fine. I mean, I remember stopping breastfeeding because I couldn't cope with feeding her. Not just that I couldn't cope with feeding her, because I couldn't cope with her being me all the time. I just wanted somebody else to have her. And I never felt like that with Jared. I couldn't understand why I felt like that with Sammy. If somebody said, "Can I have your baby?" I'd be like, "Yes." You know, have her. And most new mums aren't like that. Most new mums are like, "No, you can't touch my baby because you might give her germs." But that was me. So I gave up work 9 weeks before Jared was born, and I really didn't want to be like I was with Sammy. I wanted a mother and toddler group or something, but there wasn't any in our area that I'd been to, and they were all a bit cliquey. My next door neighbour came along and said, "Oh, we've got a new mother and toddler group, come along." So I did. And it was the Ealing one. It was Beacon, as we were back down in the old church. I was really grateful. They were really, really lovely people. They were Christians. You know, my experience of Christians up till then had been like these like really scary people that I really was quite rude to and quite nasty. And I did feel really, really guilty. I just thought, oh gosh, how could I have been so nasty? But I did. I loved being part of the mother and toddler group. I loved the people I was with. And I started to ask lots of questions because, again, you know, they were open. They told me things. And I'm thinking, that fits in with what I'm looking for. But I was thinking, no, not God, not Jesus, not Christianity, because that's not me. That's not me at all. It doesn't fit in with who I am. And so my next door neighbour, the lady I was going to Alpha with, she said, mother and toddler with, she said, "Would I like to do an Alpha?" I was like, okay, yeah, I'll come along. She said, "You can ask whatever questions you like." So I did. One of our elders told me I was the biggest pain that he'd ever met on an Alpha, because I was there just ask, argue, because I knew that I was right and they were all wrong. Or I thought I did. So yeah, and Darren took the mickey out of me every night as I went out and laughed at my conversion course. And it was, I think gradually through those weeks, I started to think, right, okay, this is actually making sense. And we went on the Holy Spirit Away Day, and I'd still got no intention of being a Christian. It wasn't for me. And we were praying. Well, no, we weren't praying. We were singing. It was before anything actually happened. We were singing, and we were singing "I Surrender." The one, you know, I'm giving you my heart and all that's within. We were singing that, and as I was singing it, I'd got my eyes closed, and somebody came in front of me, and I just felt them, you know, putting their arms out to me, and I couldn't help but cry. I just cried and cried and cried and cried. And I realised that it didn't matter what had gone on before. It didn't matter how people had hurt me. You know, none of those things mattered anymore. I was free. I was healed. I was given a second chance. And I was so overwhelmed. I was crying my eyes out. And afterwards, I just opened my eyes and I said, "Who stood in front of me?" And everybody was like, "No, I didn't stand in front of it." I was like, "Somebody stood in front of me." You can see a shadow. You know when somebody's in front of you. And it wasn't. Nobody was in front of me. It was Jesus. And that was when I gave my life. That was my first encounter with the Holy Spirit. And that was me giving my life as a Christian. And it wasn't with anybody praying for me. It wasn't with anybody touching me. It was just a pure supernatural Holy Spirit moment. And it was beautiful because it was the hurt, the anger, the insecurities, the lies, you know, you're worthless, you're worth nothing. They were all gone. Sometimes it takes time to heal. Sometimes we've still got those things. And that's what I found as a Christian since then. You know, I've been a Christian now for nearly 12 years. God still does things in me. God still gives revelations. You know, before Alpha, I didn't know that our house group were praying for us. They were next door. They used to pray for us at the end. I think it's really funny because when I started going round there, I realised what they were doing. They were like, "Oh, yeah, we put our hands on the wall." And I was like, "Oh, that's so funny. You're going to pray for Darren?" And they were like, yeah, we will. And I was like, "You'll never get Darren to be a Christian." Yeah, and he did become a Christian. And then my pastor said, you know, about my dad. He says, "You need to pray for your dad. You know, part of your healing comes from, you know, getting rid of some of the mess in your life." And he says, he wanted me to pray for my dad. And I went, "No, I'm not praying for my dad." I said, "You know, when I get to heaven, the last person I want to see come to meet me is my dad. I'm not praying for him." And Dave looked at me and he went, "No, you're going to learn that one." And again, you know, me and my arrogance, I'm like, no, I know best. So anyway, so we were praying for Darren, and I did pray for my dad as well. I listened, I had respect. 6 months later, we did Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames, and at the end, they do an altar call, and they say, you know, is this how you want your life? And at the altar call, Darren came down, and so did my dad. Yes. Absolutely amazing. You know, within that year of giving my life to God, my life had restarted. You know, not only had I become a Christian, Darren became a Christian, and so did my dad. And it was amazing because being a Christian by myself was great. Being a Christian with Darren was so much better. You know, we were now a Christian family. We were doing things together. You know, my life had completely restarted. Wounds had started to heal. You know, Joel 2:25, it says, I will repay you for the years that the locusts have eaten away. And God did. You know, God started to restore relationships. And that's not the end of my testimony, it's the start. You know, God does things with us. He refines us, he molds us. He starts to show us how he wants us to be. He starts to, you know, like Steve was saying, you know, he starts to do things that we're not comfortable with, but that he wants us to show what he wants us to be. So 11 years ago, we moved. God was in that whole new story. And we got rid of loads of stuff. We got rid of all the stuff we didn't need. We'd got 2 children by then, hadn't we? We got Sammy, we'd got Jared. Sammy was, I think, 6, Jared was 4. We were the perfect little family. We'd got our 2.4 children. We'd got a semi-detached house. You know, it was lovely. And shortly after moving, I think it was a month later, wasn't it? I found out I was pregnant. I was a bit like, oh, okay, I'm pregnant. And I'd always said, you know, if it happened, it happened. I wouldn't be gutted, but it wasn't really in our plan. So, yeah, I was pregnant for a 3rd time, and I knew. I knew straight away that it was what God wanted. It was really, again, you know, we were new Christians. Just trying to think then, we'd been Christians a couple of years, and I really, there was a lot of things. I said to Darren, do I take the morning after pill? Because I knew when I got pregnant, I knew exactly how it happened. And then I just thought, no, I can't do that. Yeah, it only takes once, kids. Yeah, so, and that was the question, do I do that? And then I thought, no, I can't. I can't take a morning after pill. If it's a second, if it's a minute, if it's a week, if it's 2 months, it's a life, and it's not my choice to take life, it's God's choice. So that was it, and I was sick, and I was going to keep it till Christmas. I was going to tell everybody at Christmas, because this is my little ideal, that I was going to tell everybody at Christmas. And Jim, oh bless him, Jim kept coming to me every week and saying, are you sure you're all right? You look really, really poorly. So in the end, I came out and told everybody I was pregnant. And by that time, you know, you got your head around it. I was absolutely ecstatic. I was so pleased to be pregnant. And it's that point, it's really, really exciting. 20 weeks, we had my scan. And it's great. They're showing us everything. And they were scanning me for ever such a long time, which I didn't remember with Sammy, but it was brilliant because we could see everything. And at the end of the scan, they said, we need you to go and see the consultant. And I thought, okay, need me to see the consultant, why? She said, you need to speak to her, I can't tell you anymore. So we were left in a room by ourselves, weren't we? And we're like, what's going on? They don't normally do that. The consultant took us into a room and she told us that our baby wasn't conducive with life. She told us that our baby had cysts on their brain, that my blood tests were high. So they thought there was something going on, and they told us that there was a focus on the heart, which was like a white spot, and it's where they don't know what's happening with the heart, what the development is. So at 20 weeks, she started telling us about that we could still have an abortion, and started filling out forms and told us that our baby had got Edwards syndrome. That was what they thought, and started filling out forms. And I was like, no. I said, no, I'm a Christian. I'm going away and I'm praying about it. I'm not interested in your forms. I'm not interested in amniocentesis or risking the life of my child, and I'm definitely not having an abortion. And we went away and we went to Darren's mum and dad because they'd got Sammy and Jared. And Darren's dad was, is this because you're a Christian? I'm like, no, it's because it's not my choice. It's God's choice, whatever goes on. And they're like, you're going to have to go through this pregnancy and you have to give birth and you're going to be ill. And I went, I'm still going to have a cesarean now. But I said, it's not my choice. Your mum was quite vehement about it, wasn't she? She was quite harsh as to why we do that to our children and bring, a baby into the world that wasn't going to survive. But we didn't care. It was just before Mother's Day, and Mother's Day, there's always a little bit of me that goes like that because it was so hard, because the kids were like, Mummy's going to have a baby, and making a big fuss of me, and it felt like the hardest day in the world. As a mother, you want to do everything to protect your children, and this was completely and utterly out of my hands. And I didn't deal with things being taken out of my hands very well, but I did now, because I'd got God, and we went to our church and they prayed for us. And through that time, I was in a bubble, total bubble, a bubble of love, of surrounding, of people being with me. Every time I dropped, somebody'd ring me, somebody'd turn up at my door. I'd be there, just starting to really coil up. Somebody would be there. And that's God. 27 weeks, we were told we'd have another scan. I was starting to get ill by then. I'd got developed diabetes, and I was getting really, really big. But 27 weeks, they took us into the same scan room, started scanning us, did loads of scans again, and I'm just thinking, I'd had my cat put down that morning. I was gutted. I was crying before we even went into the scan room. But and they looked at me, and they were looking through everything, and she says, I'm going to have to get somebody else. So she went away and she got somebody else. She came back and she went, right, the cysts on your baby's head have disappeared. She said, they've gone. And we were just, they've disappeared. She said, yeah, they've disappeared. And it was those words, they've disappeared. It was just, you could see she was really like, okay. And I said, what about the heart? And she says, there's still something there, but she says, it's got such a lot smaller, we don't really know what. So I went to the consultant. I said, what happens now? And she says, well, okay, we don't think it's Edwards syndrome, but we still think there's a very, very high risk that your baby's got Down syndrome. She says, because the fact that you developed diabetes, but also, she says, you're swelling up very much. I'd got polyhydramnios. So by then, I was at 20 weeks, I was probably looking about 7 months pregnant. And she was telling us that that's another symptom of Downs, is that the babies can't process the amniotic fluid the same way. So that was what we were expecting, wasn't it? And I was being scanned every 4 weeks. And the last 2 weeks before I gave birth, I was going in every day because my heart had started to struggle, because I was massive. I said I was like Billy the Whale. We kept thinking of names, didn't we? We were thinking everything to do with water. We were thinking Jonah and Noah. Because I was massive. I looked like I was carrying triplets. They induced me 3.5 weeks, not induced me, they did my cesarean 3.5 weeks before, because I was so big. They were really worried that if I went into natural labour, that my cord would prolapse and the baby'd strangle straight away. So we went in and they did the cesarean, and it was like, Charlie Dimmock, water features. I was a water feature. As soon as they did the first cut, it just started spurting everywhere. They have little sluice trays down the side of the section bed, and I was tilted because I couldn't have the weight on me. As soon as I was lying on my back, I started fainting because of all the pressure. But these sluice trays, they were full and overflowing. That was how much fluid there were. It was ridiculous. I wanted to see my baby being born because I hadn't seen the other two being born, and the registrar was like, no, you can't. Blah, blah, blah. So the anaesthetist was great, wasn't he? As they started to take the final cuts and get the baby out, he actually pulled the sheet away so that I could see my baby being born. And he was perfect. He was absolutely perfect. We didn't go with Jonah, we didn't go with Noah, we went with Aaron. Because I was doing kids' church at the time, and I love the story of Exodus. I love the story of how Moses brought the Israelites through the desert. I loved that continual thing of that the Israelites just kept messing about and messing God about. And I just thought, that's what we do as humans. And I love the fact that, Moses was faithful, but then he'd got Aaron, and I loved Aaron. I loved his story in the Bible. I loved the fact that he came up behind Moses, that he held his arms up. Aaron was a mountain. Aaron was strong. And so that was why we called our little boy Aaron. And that was awesome. God heals. Fact. God healed my child, and God did something completely different in me. God brought me through a whole journey of faith that I could have never imagined. Again, testimony, it is test. I wouldn't have learned faith without God putting me in a position where I had to put all my faith, all my hope in him. All my hope is in Jesus. And, God's done so much for us. I can't go through everything that God's done for us because it's such a lot. But God's put people with us. We had a new house. We built an extension. We had an extra room. We always said that room was for God. And God's put people with us. God's put people with us. And it always seems to be people that haven't got families or people who've lost someone. Like, Shane, who was here last week, he lost his mum when he was 13. She committed suicide. He put him with a family. He gave him a mum. We've had loads of people who come to stay with us just for a few weeks, and they've ended up staying months and years. Recently, we had my daughter's boyfriend. He was living with us. Again, he'd got an awful relationship with his mum. And God does seem to put people with us who need to know what a mum's like, to know what a family's like, to know what God's love's like. And God is love. God heals. God restores. God healed my relationship with my dad. And my dad was doing great. My dad was really, really doing great. He'd changed. I can't tell you how much my dad changed. He was painting and decorating. He did all the old church buildings. He did Merv's old office buildings. He was having a lovely life. And then he met a woman in church and he married, and he was so happy. It was lovely, and our relationship, it really was restored. I mean, he still used to have bad days, but our relationship was awesome. It was just, I'd love my dad again. I never, ever thought I'd love my dad again. Ari adored his granddad. My dad used to come. Still hard now sometimes when I come home from work and it's a nice day, because my dad used to be there, and he'd be there in the car and he'd bring his dog and we'd walk down and we'd pick Ari up from school, and then Ari would come back from school and he'd read to him. And Dad got married, and just before he got married, he'd start having quite a lot of chest problems. They said it was acute bronchitis, but it wasn't acute bronchitis. We found out just before he got married, he'd got something called IPF, which is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. The first bit means they don't know what's caused it. We think it was when he worked in a foundry because it was hot. So gradually he got sicker and sicker. I mean, he got married July. He didn't actually admit to anybody. He never admitted to anybody. He wouldn't even admit to me and Linda how ill he was or what it was. We knew because we'd gone away and researched internet, as you do. And gradually he got worse and worse and worse to the point that December, he was still working in December, and he ended up in hospital. And that was when they were showing us that pulmonary fibrosis, what it does is you get scar tissue on the lungs, and the lungs try to heal themselves, and they form into honeycombs, and then gradually what happens is the lungs diminish and they just lose. They lose their ability to be a lung. They're more like a brick. So the December they told him he was very seriously ill. He needed to be on oxygen. He said, no, don't need to be on oxygen. Discharged himself, came home. Him and Linda went down in the motorhome down to Devon after Christmas in -4 temperatures and stayed in the middle of a fire field. My dad was so stubborn, so funny. He wasn't taking any notice of what anybody had said. He wasn't having oxygen. He was still functioning. And then they came back, and 2 weeks later, he was taken into hospital again by ambulance, and they said, look at his x-rays. I came in from work. Linda said they've said that he's got 2 weeks maximum. They don't know how he's breathing. They don't know how he's walking around, but he is. And we prayed. We prayed and we prayed, and nobody could have prayed harder than I did for my dad. The church prayed. I'd got people in a prayer line praying. And it's really, really hard. It's hard when our will isn't God's will. And we can pray till we're blue in the face. We can be the most faithful Christians ever. But if it's not what God wants, it's not going to happen. Because, God knows what he wants. And, over 3 days, my dad gradually slipped away. And he died. And it was, if a death can be perfect, it was a perfect death. Darren and I had been out there over the weekend. we'd got home, we'd had 3 hours sleep, and they'd called us in, and Dave came, he was the pastor then, and we were all praying with my dad, and they took him off the oxygen, and his heart was still going, and we prayed with him, and you know, we prayed him away, really, and that was it, he'd gone. And it was absolutely devastating. You know, this is the person who said, the last person I want to see coming to meet me in heaven is my dad. I was heartbroken. I can't explain to you. It was a physical hurt. After my dad died, my heart hurt. And I couldn't believe what had happened, but I know he's gone to heaven. And I know he is. I know he's going to come out and meet me. I know, you know, God's got him. And, you know, 12 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have had that grief because I didn't like my dad. I wouldn't have had that love in my life. And that's it, you know, God restored. And yes, God took away. I love Blessed Be Your Name. I remember coming in after my dad died, and that was the song that was being played. And it's that bit of you give and take away, you give and take away. And I just thought, yeah, you do, you give, but you take away. And that's what I wanted to say. You know, God does restore. God brought something really, really special back to me. But God doesn't always put into prayers the way that we want. I'd seen a prayer answered absolutely miraculously. I'd seen my son healed. But then I lost my dad. But, you know, God had done so much in the meantime. There's lots of other stuff. When I was with the women, I was giving a testimony of how God helped us financially. 4 years ago, we were in a bit of a mess. Darren was having problems with his leg. He'd had a problem with his back, basically. The story is, he broke his leg playing rugby when he was 17, and his leg never healed properly. It went bent, and it caused loads of problems. It caused problems with his back. He had to have a disc taken out of his back. He'd had a few operations on his knee because he's got no cartilage in his knee. And they wanted to do a big operation. They wanted to break his leg and reset it so his leg was straight, so it would take the pain off his knee. It meant he would be off work for 4 to 6 months. He'd already been off for a month because he'd slipped on the ice and hurt it. And so financially, we were a bit of a mess. We'd got provision. I knew we'd got provision for that time, but our provision was dwindling. And you know, that was the point we're at. We were plodding through, and Darren was doing great, and his operation was awesome. So much so that, I mean, if you've been in church recently, you'll know that he's done a triathlon since then. He's done runs for charity. He's doing the silly mud and water lunacy obstacle course run to raise money with the youth to get rid of Beth. And send our young people to Soul Survivor. So yeah, if you haven't sponsored them yet, please do. There you go, there's a plug. But yeah, so he's done amazing things then. Again, God has brought so much healing. But it was a hard time for us. But financially, we were, you know, we'd got savings, we were doing all right. But we got to the point where we were dwindling in our savings. And we got to the point where I knew I was quite ill. It's that point when you're a mum, isn't it? You look after everybody else and you do things. And I knew I was stressed with everything that was going on with Darren. They kept changing his appointments. I knew that it was going to be big. He couldn't actually put his weight on his foot for, was it 10 weeks? You know, he'd got to have crutches and he couldn't put anything on his foot. And he was in and out of hospital. It was over the orthopaedic and it was going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. I was getting really stressed out. My stomach was really, really playing up. The first time was when we had a Soul Sisters thing at Costa, and I got really, really bad stomach in the night. I didn't know what it was about. And I just thought, this is stress. It's Darren's there. Darren's mum and dad had decided to go to Canada for 7 weeks. So they weren't about to help. And I was just thinking, what if happens in the middle of the night? What if he starts bleeding? And all these things are going through my head, messing with my head, and I was just thinking, oh, this is the cause of my stress, this is the cause of my stomach. Just after Darren had his operation, when he was still in hospital, I started bleeding from a back passage quite badly. That's the point when you realise that things aren't right. didn't know what was going on. I started looking and I knew what tests they'd have to do, and I didn't want to have those tests done. And I knew what it looked like, and I didn't want to look like that either. So in my wisdom and knowledge, I ignored it. As you do, or as you don't. So it was November by then, and I went into church the one Sunday morning, and Linda was filling up the urn in the room. It was when we were at Chase Terrace. And I was just talking to her, and she went, "Are you all right?" I thought, "Oh, no. Yeah, great." No, she says, "Are you all right?" And I went, "No." She went, "What's the matter?" And I told her, and she went, "Right, you need to get to the doctors. You need to go tomorrow. I'm going to ring you up tomorrow evening. If you haven't gone to the doctors, I'm going to tell Darren." I'm like, whatever. But I knew I'd got to. I knew that God had prompted somebody that I trust to ask me. And I did. I went to the doctors. I had to tell Darren that evening. Poor Darren, he hadn't got a clue. So I had to tell him everything that had been going on. And Darren was like, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I was like, "Because it's embarrassing. Because I don't want to admit it. Because if I pretend it's not there, it will go away." And I went to the doctors, and the doctor said, "I think you've got bowel cancer." It was quite good and quite blunt. Within 2 weeks, I'd seen a consultant. The consultant had referred me to somebody else. New Year's Eve, I'd got a camera to look, and they found a tumour, quite a big tumour, at the end of my bowel. It was the size of a £2 coin. Again, I went away and researched, and I realised that I'd got, I think it was a 1 in 50 chance with a tumour that size. But hey, I came back, said to the church, "Can you pray?" I was still doing kids' church at that point, and really, we just didn't want the children to know at that point what was going on. So they all went out, and I asked the church to pray. And it's strange, because at the time, I knew it was huge. I knew it was bowel cancer. I'd not known anybody survive from bowel cancer in the previous year. 2 people in our church had died from bowel cancer. But I knew that God was sorting it. You know, whatever happened, God was sorting it, and I'd got God. My biggest worry was my family. It really was. I was really, really worried. More than anything, you know, financially it was worrying me. There's a lot to the financial story, and it's a big story, but my main thing was that I was worried that if I died, that Darren wouldn't have enough to pay for my funeral. And I didn't want to leave him with a mess. And, you know, the money came to show me that we could pay for a funeral. The money came to show me that we didn't need to worry about money, that we didn't need to worry about Darren going back to work. He did go back to work, and he went back to work, and within a week, work were really awful to him. I can't tell you how awful they were when he was off. They advertised his job 3 times. They couldn't get anybody to do it. When he'd been back at work, one of the blokes turned up on the doorstep the one night with £300 in an envelope that they'd had in a collection. You know, God provided for us. God showed us that it didn't matter what was going on, that he was there, he was providing. And that's the thing, it's hard sometimes, because sometimes it's not just the spiritual aspects, sometimes it's the physical aspects, and God provided for everything. And God gave me a word. It was Olivia, and I loved the word that God gave me, because it was just awesome. She said, Jehovah Nissi, she says, "Go away and look it up." Didn't really mean anything to me. I'd been told, because with my operation, they told me there was significant risk of death just because of the length of the operation, because the extent of the operation, they had to remove 2/3 of my bowel. And I went away and I looked at Jehovah Nissi, and it's beautiful. Exodus 17, 8-16. Moses and the Israelites are in battle. He was called to lead the Israelites into battle, and he stationed himself on the top of a hill to pray. This is Moses. And he had with him his brother Aaron and his assistant Hur. And as Moses lifted his hands and prayed, the Israelites prevailed in battle. But when he let his hands down, Amalek prevailed. So Aaron and Hur, they set Moses on a rock, and they held his hands up for him until the battle that was totally won. And this is the passage that I knew. And this is why Aaron was Aaron, because I loved what Aaron did in this passage. And it says at the end of the day, there was victory. And God told Moses to write down what had happened and read it in Joshua's hearing. And it says, it goes on, and then it says, instead of raising a flag, Moses built an altar, because in those times, an altar was often used as a place of remembering or marking an important event. And this is where Moses called God Jehovah Nissi, because he understood the revelation that God himself is our banner. God himself is our victory. He's the one who wins our battles, and he still does that. You know, that was the word that was given to me, that God had got me. God was my banner. We always say within the worship team that, you know, when armies went into battle, that first the worship team went with a battle cry. The banners were there with a battle cry, because they went and they proclaimed victory. And that was what God was telling me. And at the time, again, you know, I didn't know, but God did that. You know, God did give me the victory. You know, after I had an extensive operation, it took a long time to recover, but a year later there was no signs of cancer. There's been no reoccurrence. You know, God is my victory. God is my banner. God is my overcomer. Cancer's horrible. We all know cancer's horrible. Cancer's one of those things, it lurks, it threatens you, and it's hard because it has refused to leave me alone a little bit. You know, the last couple of years I've had a shadow on my breast. I'd had a skin cancer on my head. They took that out. They took it, came back. They took it out again. I'd got another lump on my bowel recently, but again, it wasn't cancerous. But, you know, God's got me. You know, I don't care. It can do whatever it likes. God's got me. You know, Aaron was talking to the youth about fear on Friday, and he says, you know, ultimately, if we believe in God, we're with him. So there's no fear, because we're in a win-win situation. Whatever goes on, you know, God's got our back. He's in front of us. He's behind us. He's beside us. You know, my life is brilliant. I started with that, didn't I? And my life is brilliant. My life is brilliant because God's made it brilliant. We've just come back from 3 weeks in Canada, and I was supposed to be reading Genesis. We do Bible books that we choose with the youth, and I couldn't get past chapter 1, because it's saying that, you know, God made the mountains and God made the sea and it was good, and he made the whales and he made all the creatures, and we saw those, didn't we? We saw whales, we saw the creatures, we saw the mountains, we saw how perfect and how beautiful God had made it. And the first day after we'd flown in, we walked up Sulphur Mountain. And I stood on the top, and I'm surrounded by mountains, snow-capped mountains, and it's beautiful. And I can't tell you how much I cried in Canada at all the beautiful things. And I'm there, and I'm thinking, I'm on top of a mountain. Look at all these mountains. A lot of people, I said, would have looked small or felt small. I didn't feel small. I felt that God's put me there exactly where he wants me to be. And I realised in that moment how much God loves me. He loves me so much that he stood me on top of a mountain, you know, in a country 9.5 hours away, because he wants me to be there. He's put me there in that place because he wants me to be, and because he loves me, because he loves me so much, because he loves us so much. You know, God loves each and every one of us. None of us are a mistake. No matter what anybody has told you in your past, you're never, ever a mistake. God doesn't make mistakes. God makes perfection. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we saw that perfection. We saw how much God loves us. And I love the song that I did this morning. It absolutely had me in bits. You know, take courage, my heart. Stay steadfast, my soul. It's in the waiting. Sometimes we have to wait. You know, hold on to your hope as your victory unfolds. He's never failing. You know, God never fails. God never makes mistakes. God's there.